It's a bit disorganised and we had a falling out.
It makes it more and more difficult to employ people and run a business.
Yeah. But the people making the rules have never had to run businesses.
No.
So they don't understand.
Jeremy Clarkson's pub disaster nobody saw coming. 4 months, 0 empty tables, a 360-space car park, packed on most days, and at the end of it all, a loss of £8,486. How does that even happen? A business everyone is desperate to get into, still finishing in the red. Was this bad planning on Jeremy Clarkson's part, or is there something more deliberate hiding underneath a number that looks, at first glance, like failure? He put the figure out there himself, calmly, no excuses attached. So why would someone this experienced in business let his most talked about pub bleed cash while it's fully booked night after night? Stick with me, because the answer isn't what most people assumed when this story broke. A loss nobody expected from a pub this busy. When Jeremy Clarkson shared the figures behind the farmer's dog in June 2026, he did something you rarely see from anyone running a business under this much public attention. He gave people the real number, not a rounded-off version, not something an accountant would rather keep tucked away in a spreadsheet nobody outside the company ever opens. He stated, plainly, that the pub had lost £8,486 before tax across its first 4 months of proper trading. There was no attempt to cushion it with talk of a tough economy, no blaming suppliers, no lengthy statement designed to bury the number in extra context. He said it, the same way he said uncomfortable things on camera for the better part of 3 decades. Now, here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear, restaurant loses money? For most of us, it's an image of empty chairs, quiet weeknights, a dining room with more staff than customers, someone behind the bar checking the clock, wondering whether it's even worth staying open past 9. That slow, familiar decline that eventually ends with a handwritten notice taped to the window on some wet Tuesday, and nobody outside the village ever hears about it. That is not what was happening at the Farmer's Dog. According to Clarkson, the place was completely booked every single day, not just weekends, not just the occasional busy stretch, every day, for 4 straight months. In an industry where a full dining room is treated as the ultimate win, here was a pub achieving exactly that and still ending up with negative numbers on the page. That contradiction, overwhelming demand sitting right next to an actual financial loss, is really what this entire story comes down to. And it points to something uncomfortable about hospitality economics in this country that rarely gets discussed openly. Because this isn't only about one celebrity-owned pub in the Cotswolds. It's a pattern quietly repeating itself across hundreds of independently owned pubs every single year, ones that never end up in a headline, run by people without anything close to Clarkson's financial cushion. Being full and being profitable are 2 completely separate things. They always have been. And that gap between them is exactly where a large number of genuinely well-run pubs, staffed by people who care about what they do, quietly close their doors without anyone outside their own village ever noticing. So if being full doesn't guarantee profit, what does it actually take to lose money while turning away customers every night? That's where this gets interesting. Where all that money actually went. Start with the car park, because it tells you something before you've even stepped through the front door. Space for 360 vehicles isn't a figure you plan around for a small local pub, hoping for a decent Sunday roast crowd. That's a number built for people willing to travel 40 minutes, an hour, sometimes considerably longer, because they'd seen a farm on their television screen and wanted to be part of whatever that experience was. And by every account, that's exactly what happened. People showed up in numbers that would make most publicans weep with relief. So if demand clearly wasn't the issue, where did the money disappear to? Start with wages. The Farmer's Dog reportedly employs around 146 people. Sit with that figure for a second, because it's an extraordinary number for a single pub. Most venues of similar size operate with a small fraction of that headcount. But 146 salaries, 146 sets of national insurance contributions, 146 people who need training, scheduling, supervising, and paying regardless of whether the till is busy or completely dead. That's a payroll built for something closer to a large-scale operation than a standard village pub. Running at that scale costs money in ways that never show up directly on the menu. Then there's the sourcing strategy. And this is where Clarkson's own choices start working against the bottom line in ways he clearly anticipated. The pub reportedly runs on strictly British ingredients, not British whenever it happens to be cheaper, but British without exception. That means black pepper grown domestically instead of the imported version, at a price that can run several times higher. British beef instead of whichever cut happens to be cheapest on the international market that particular week. A wine list that, by Clarkson's own admission, has given his accountant more than a few restless nights. Every ingredient in that kitchen tells a story about a British farmer, a British field, a British growing season, and every one of those choices adds cost, compared to a cheaper option sitting on the exact same supplier's shelf. It's worth pausing here. Committing entirely to British suppliers with no exceptions is probably the clearest example in this whole story of Clarkson choosing the harder, costlier path when an easier one was readily available. Most restaurants, even ones that market themselves on local sourcing, tend to quietly make exceptions once the price gap becomes too painful. A cheaper imported alternative slips in without customers noticing or caring. Clarkson, by his own account, didn't take that route. He held the commitment even when it meant accepting a thinner margin on nearly every dish leaving the kitchen. Ask yourself honestly, would you notice if the pepper on your plate came from Cornwall or somewhere considerably cheaper overseas? Almost certainly not. That's exactly the bet he made. Layer on top of that the broader pressures every hospitality business across the country has been dealing with recently. Energy bills climbing, regardless of how fashionable your pub happens to be. Higher employer national insurance contributions landing on every business owner at once. A rural job market where finding, training, and holding on to decent staff has become its own quiet, ongoing struggle. None of that is unique to Clarkson's operation. What is unique is that he's absorbing all of those industry-wide pressures while simultaneously opting for the most expensive version of almost every decision available to him. Put all of it together, a payroll sized for a destination venue, ingredients bought at a self-imposed premium, and a cost environment already squeezing every operator in the trade, and a pub that's fully booked every night, while still finishing 4 months in the red, starts to make a strange kind of sense. Here's the part worth understanding properly before writing this off as simple mismanagement, or a wealthy man discovering late in life that pubs are harder to run than they appear. Clarkson had already worked this out well before the June announcement made it public. In an earlier interview, delivered in the same flat, unbothered tone he brings to nearly everything, he described the pub's food economics in a way most business owners would never say out loud on the record. He described it, roughly, as a clever way of turning £100 into about £94. Read that back slowly, because it's worth noticing exactly how unusual that admission is. He wasn't confused about the maths. He wasn't blindsided by a loss he hadn't seen coming. He described the food side of this business, in his own words, as something that loses money more or less on purpose, and he said it before a single official account existed, to confirm he was right. That is not the language of someone who got caught out. That's the language of someone who understood the exact shape of this business, down to the pence, long before the doors ever opened. And once you know that, the whole story starts to look completely different. The business model hiding behind the menu. So why would anyone deliberately build a food offering they already know loses money? Why pick the most expensive pepper in the entire country when a cheaper one sits on the exact same supplier's shelf, one aisle over, at a fraction of the price, with no diner ever likely to notice the difference on their plate? Because the food was never meant to be where the profit sits. The food is the reason people are willing to drive 40 minutes or more and queue in a car park without even holding a reservation, just to say they've been there. The food fills every seat in the building. It gives the entire enterprise its reason to exist in the first place. What happens once those seats are filled, and what people order alongside their meal, is a completely separate question. And that second question is the one that actually decides whether this business survives once the initial curiosity fades away. This is where Hawkstone enters the picture, and the two businesses have clearly been built to work in tandem, not by accident. Every pint of Hawkstone lager sold across that bar comes back to Clarkson at full margin. Not the thin, negotiated margin a pub earns pouring someone else's beer under a distribution agreement, but full margin, because he owns the brewery and he owns the pub, with no third party sitting in between taking a cut. So picture a table of 6 sitting down for a British-sourced Sunday roast that loses a small amount of money the moment it leaves the kitchen, and then ordering 4 rounds of Hawkstone lager alongside it. The loss on the food and the profit on the beer are quietly balancing each other out in the background, a calculation the diners themselves never actually see happening. Sometimes that balance tips in the pub's favor by the end of the month. Sometimes, as this particular set of accounts shows, it doesn't quite even out yet. And that's really the honest story sitting underneath the £8,486 figure. It isn't proof that the whole strategy has failed. 4 months is a small window in the life of any hospitality business, especially one still finding its rhythm, still figuring out staffing levels against real demand, still bedding in a kitchen built around premium British sourcing that takes time to run efficiently. What the number actually demonstrates is something far less dramatic and far more useful to understand. Even with full demand every single day, even with a car park that almost never sits empty, even with a payroll built for genuine scale, the food side of a proper British hospitality business can still lose money. That isn't carelessness on Clarkson's part. That's an honest, uncomfortable admission of a problem the wider industry has quietly lived with for years, without much public discussion. Think about what that means for every smaller publican across the country who doesn't have a beer brand sitting behind them, doesn't have a television series funneling customers to their door, and doesn't have deep enough pockets to absorb a loss and simply keep going. If a pub with this much built-in advantage can still finish a period in the red, what real chance does the ordinary village local have, run by a couple who've poured their entire savings into it with nothing similar waiting behind the bar? That's the uncomfortable truth underneath this whole story. It was never really about whether Clarkson could personally afford an £8,486 loss. Of course he could, several times over without blinking. It's about what that loss actually reveals regarding the true cost of running a properly staffed, quality-focused British pub in 2026. Costs that stay brutal even when every single decision you're making is working exactly as intended. It's also worth pointing out how unusual it is for a business owner in his position to let this level of detail become public at all. Most companies of this size treat early financial figures as something to manage carefully, released only alongside a broader narrative about growth plans, future investment, and long-term vision. Clarkson skipped almost all of that. He let the number speak for itself, with barely any framing around it. That decision alone tells you something about how confident he is in the underlying strategy, even while the headline figure looks negative on its own. There's also a timing element worth considering. 4 months of trading data genuinely isn't very much to judge any hospitality business on, let alone one built around a sourcing philosophy that's completely different from almost every competitor nearby. Kitchens take time to become efficient. Staff take time to settle into a rhythm that matches actual footfall rather than early guesswork. Suppliers take time to negotiate better terms once volume becomes predictable rather than speculative. A loss recorded in the earliest stretch of trading isn't automatically a preview of where the business ends up 12 or 18 months down the line, and treating it that way misses a large part of how new hospitality ventures typically behave. What most of the coverage got wrong. Most of the headlines that followed this announcement reached for the same predictable joke: a celebrity who can't run a business properly. That take completely misses what's actually interesting here. This isn't a story about incompetence at all. It's a story about someone who, over the last several years, has quietly stitched together 4 connected businesses out of a single farm: the television series, the farm shop, the brewery, and now the pub, and who understands better than most people in British media that not every part of that ecosystem needs to profit entirely on its own terms. The farm shop reportedly turns over more than £1 million a year, despite unpredictable opening hours and famously limited parking. The brewery has been valued somewhere around £75 million, built from barley that nobody particularly cared about buying before Clarksons' farm made the crop interesting to a mainstream audience. The television series costs him essentially nothing extra to produce and functions as possibly the most effective advertisement British agriculture has ever had. And the pub sits right in the middle of all of it, not as a standalone venue that needs to balance its own books in isolation, but as the physical place where all of that accumulated goodwill turns into actual people, standing in a British field, holding a British pint, having driven considerably further than logic would suggest just to say they were there. Seen through that lens, an £8,486 loss across 4 months isn't a crisis at all. It's closer to a rounding error against the scale of what the pub is quietly doing for the rest of the operation. Every one of those fully booked nights is also free advertising. Every table of diners who take a photo, mention it to friends, or book a return visit for a birthday, that's marketing no advertising budget could realistically buy, delivered by a business that's simultaneously losing a small, manageable amount of money on the very food that got them through the door in the first place. Here's something worth thinking about the next time you see a business online that looks like it's booming. It's easy to assume that constant bookings, endless social media buzz, and long queues automatically mean a business is thriving financially. This story is a useful reminder that visibility and viability aren't the same thing. A packed dining room tells you people are interested. It doesn't tell you anything about margins, overheads, or whether the underlying cost structure can actually support that level of interest indefinitely. Plenty of businesses have mistaken attention for sustainability and paid for that mistake later, often after scaling up staff and premises to match short-term demand that eventually cools off. What sets this situation apart is that Clarkson appears to have built the entire structure with that risk already priced in from the start. Rather than hoping the food side eventually becomes profitable on its own, he built a completely separate, already profitable business specifically to sit alongside it and absorb the shortfall. That's a meaningfully different approach compared to most hospitality ventures, which tend to launch on the hope that volume alone will eventually solve the margin problem, only to discover months or years later that it doesn't. That doesn't mean the loss can simply be waved away as clever strategy in every single instance. 4 months is still early days, and if the pattern continues without the food side tightening up at all, even Clarkson's patience and Hawkstone's margins will eventually hit a limit somewhere down the line. A business built to lose money by design still needs that design to add up in the end, especially once the initial wave of curiosity settles into something far more ordinary and repeatable. What he's built, in other words, isn't a machine guaranteed to keep working forever. It's a genuinely interesting bet that brand loyalty, beer margin, and a story people want to feel part of can outrun a kitchen that loses money on purpose, for as long as it takes the whole operation to find its natural balance point. Why this story matters beyond one pub. Step back for a moment from Clarkson specifically and think about the wider trade he's operating in. British hospitality has been through a genuinely difficult few years. Rising costs on almost every front, tighter margins, and a public that's become far more price-sensitive after years of inflation squeezing household budgets. Against that backdrop, plenty of pub owners have made the opposite decision to Clarkson, cutting corners wherever they can to protect margin, switching suppliers, trimming menus, reducing staff hours. Understandable choices, given the pressure they're under. What makes the farmer's dog such an interesting case study is that it's essentially running the experiment in reverse. Instead of asking how cheaply can we deliver this experience, the question guiding every decision seems to have been, how good can we make this? And how do we make the economics work around that ambition? That's a genuinely different starting point, and the early numbers suggest it's an expensive one to prove out, even with a car park full of customers backing the bet. There's a version of this story where the food side never fully closes that gap, where the beer margin simply becomes a permanent subsidy baked into the business model. And honestly, that might be perfectly fine. Plenty of successful business structures rely on one part of the operation supporting another indefinitely. Cinemas make far more from popcorn than ticket sales. Supermarkets often sell certain staple items at a loss, purely to get people through the door and buying everything else. Clarkson's pub might simply be applying that same logic to a much more visible, much more personal kind of business, one built around his own name and reputation, rather than a faceless corporate brand. Reading between the lines of £8,486. So let's return to where this all started. A pub fully booked every single night for 4 months. A loss of £8,486, sitting quietly underneath all that demand, almost like a weight hidden beneath an otherwise very expensive-looking rug. It's tempting to treat those two facts as a contradiction, proof that even someone as experienced and successful as Jeremy Clarkson can misjudge the numbers on a project this size. But that's not really what's happening here. What this really shows is more useful than a simple celebrity business blunder. In modern British hospitality, being full doesn't mean being profitable. Premium, genuinely British-sourced food carries real costs, while running a 146-person destination venue brings overheads a village local never faces. Most importantly, Clarkson understood this from the start and built a separate business to cover the gap. The farmer's dog isn't necessarily failing. It's following a loss-leading strategy, bringing people in for an experience that costs more to deliver, while expecting the wider business to make up the difference. 4 months in, the numbers haven't balanced yet. Whether they do over the next 12 months is the real story, and a revealing look at how thin the line is between a packed, successful-looking business and one quietly struggling. So that's the real surprise. Not a disaster, but a fully booked house, a genuine loss on paper, and a man who seems completely unbothered. Clarkson built this operation knowing where the real money was. So, do you think the farmer's dog turns things around within the next year? Or is this an early warning the rest of the trade should watch? Would you have made the same bet Clarkson did? Let us know in the comments. We genuinely read them. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Clarkson's business empire, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next.